So this is the second part of the talk, which I split up because I wanted to be sure that no one needed to spend more than a half an hour a day on this topic, and so those who are looking at this, assuming that you're doing it online, so this will be online for some people, so I cut the talk in half. So this is part 2. That should be clearly conveyed as we present this to people. This is the second part of the talk, which you should listen to on the second day. So first, listen to the first talk, and then do the meditation. Next day, do the meditation, then listen to the second talk. Third day, repeat. Started the first part of the talk. So now we're moving into a talk having experienced our bodies without putting most of our energy into thinking or into learning about what various people on various websites have to say about something. And that's very different. Because what this era asks us to do, what we are being asked to do as a human species, is face death. Face sickness, aging, and death. We do not want to die. It's very important to us that we not die. Death is seen as a big problem. It's very bad that people die. This is the usual way of seeing it. And so we push it away. We do our best to be sure that if people die, they do so far away from other people. They go through the process of aging and sickness and death in a special place where people don't see them, and the rest of us can continue on with our, quote, lives. There are lots of strange stories about this. As some of you know, I have a friend who was teaching in the school system, and he told me that the current way they teach the life cycle is that there are 3 parts. You're born, you grow up, and you reproduce. That's the life cycle. And she said, but what about death? And she said, well, we don't want to make the children uncomfortable. Isn't that amazing? And besides, it isn't really part of life anyway. Death is something different from life. And this is the life cycle. We took out the uncomfortable part of it, and it's not really part of life anyway. Nowadays, people are passing away in hospitals due to this new virus, and people aren't allowed to see them. People are kept away from them. Not allowed to die with your loved ones. We've given that much authority over to that establishment. You die alone. And beyond that, you can't be with someone who dies. Death is just too scary for us. And it's seen as too horrible that people die. And so we talk about this as if we're saving lives. But we're not. All we're doing is postponing deaths, usually by only a very little bit. So many of the people, a large percentage of the people who will die of the coronavirus this year, would have died this year anyway. And yet we're happy to push off that death just a bit, push off the death several months, because we consider that several months of loneliness to be more important than being with loved ones at that most important transition. We're terrified of death. And because of it, we've lost our minds. We're insane. And rather than face death, rather than face the experience of dying, we're willing to live a life, a societal life, that destroys life on the planet, destroys life as we know it. We're willing to kill life as we know it, so that we ourselves don't have to face death. And then that results in similar situations at the other end of life. There are mothers who have this virus currently in many places aren't allowed to be with their newborns. Or their newborns are taken from them, causing permanent trauma to those people, those infants, and that moves into the rest of their life, traumatized forever. And it somehow makes sense to us to cause this much emotional and psychological damage because we worship, we revere the avoidance of death. It's driven us insane, our unwillingness to face death, so that we've become a source of killing. We've become a source of the destruction of life because of our unwillingness to face a part of life, that being death. One of the things that's very hard for people to understand is the difference between killing and dying. As I like to say, peace on earth is when everyone dies and nobody kills. That is peace on earth. It's completely reasonable that everyone would die. And that is exactly the situation we're in right now. Everyone dies. That is not a problem. That's as it should be. It's appropriate that everyone dies. And it's appropriate, it is best if no one kills. But because human beings refuse to die, we're willing to destroy life. Even destroy our own lives, the lives of our children. Because this crisis is an issue, but there are other crises that are much more serious. But they're hard to face. It's hard to face death. As many of you know, a long time ago, a few thousand years ago, there was an individual who was brought up distant from death. He was deceived into thinking that there wasn't death. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. And he grew up in a palace, few palaces apparently, and was kept away from any sense that there is death, that there is sickness, that there is aging, that there is instability or impermanence in life. And in his late 20s, he suddenly came to realize that people die. And it's interesting because here we are at this strange time in history when most everyone was brought up the way he was. We talked about this here. It turned out very few people have experienced death directly in people they know, or in near-death experiences in their own lives. This is fascinating. We're all in this position where we think that probably death is something distant that may or may not happen to other people. And in fact, I heard someone speak about, he said, he was describing why it is that we're not as close to death nowadays, and he said it's because in previous times more people died. That's what he said. This is an intelligent individual who actually believes, he said in a public statement, that more people died previously in human history than die now. So just for the record, precisely the same percentage of people die now as died in the past. It is exactly the same. There has been no change whatsoever. It is exactly 100% of people. That is how many people die. And if he wanted to say that more people died in absolute terms, well, he's still wrong. Because in absolute terms, more people die now than ever before, since there are more people now than ever before. So, we have lost our minds on this topic. And it's worth looking at someone else who is deluded in the way that we are, because he made good use of it. He took advantage of the opportunity of waking up from his delusion. And when he realized that people get sick and die, he made a certain decision. And it's important to be clear, before we say what he did, that we note what he didn't do. He did not become a doctor. He saw death as a problem. He was unwilling to accept it. That I refuse to die. I won't do it. And he did not then become a doctor. Many of us feel that we have this problem of death, and a good way to solve it is through the medical establishment. But the medical establishment has not saved a single life in all of human history. It has only postponed some deaths. Not one life has been saved by medicine of any kind anywhere in the world. It has, however, postponed some deaths, often by just a bit of time, sometimes by years, sometimes decades, sometimes days, but not centuries. If you want to solve the problem of death, the only way is through spirituality. And this is a way of saying what spirituality is. It's a way of defining spirituality. It solves the problem of death. You can solve that problem in this way. But the issue of death isn't merely one of physical dying. Right now, the stories that we tell need to die. The stories that we tell about civilization, the stories that we tell about ourselves. Who are we? What do we live for? What is the world all about? These stories have come to their end. And in terms of spirituality, we find out that the way we solve the problem of death is by letting go. There are many different ways of doing that. Different traditions have different explanations for how that's done, and I appreciate them. But when we look at our civilization, the story that we tell about it, that also we have to let go. We need a different way of living. We need a different way of moving forward. This cannot continue. And in the same way as personally we sit and we pay attention to our feelings, We pay attention to that. That's one spiritual technique. And if we take it far enough, we will completely solve forever the problem of death. That problem will be completely resolved, and we will discover that which does not die. We'll awaken to that, be liberated from that which does die. We can do that internally, personally. And it's important that we do a practice like this every day. So, good news. We just did. We just did an hour of that practice, and that's exactly what needs to be done. That's what we should do personally. So once again, rather than spending hours looking at a screen, being brainwashed and freaked out and traumatized, again and again as we get drawn into the mainstream narrative, rather than that, we purify the thinking, the views, the fixed notions that trap us and traumatize us. So we have done that work. But beyond that, if we want to create a new story, if we want to let go of the old story, it's important that we're in a community of people who can create that story based on wisdom. This is hard work. We spent a long time writing this story. History, as we call it. And it is the work that is needed, the challenge of our age, to let that one die and let a new one be born. That is done in community. And so, if we do the work within, there's also work that we do in our relationships, in our communities. And that work is the work of moving our bodies, moving our dwellings into a community of trustworthy people who are willing to face death, who are willing to face the death of ourselves individually and the culture as a whole, and let something new burst forth. Let a new story begin that isn't destroying life on earth, that isn't denying our true nature. It isn't based on endless greed and fear, hatred, insanity, but is based on joy and safety and wisdom. Before the next crisis comes, move into a community of trustworthy people who are actually solving the problem, which is our attachment to a certain way of looking at the world and the behaviors that are associated with that. Do that. That's the heroic move. That's the heroic act. It could be any number of communities. Of course, there's this community here, but there are many more. And that is how we take advantage of these crises to grow, to mature, rather than just get drawn more and more deeply into a certain direction. It is amazing to me to watch people surrender to the general flow of the world in a time of crisis like this. Just surrender to it. Yes, major corporation. Facilitate, analyze, assess my social interactions as I maintain them through video conference, as I descend deeper and deeper into loneliness, which I'm trying to deal with through these little hits of excitement over social media that aren't really fulfilling. We're willing to be hurt, damaged, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, because of our fear of death. Don't want to rock the boat. And so we fall into these patterns, and we let forces control our lives more and more, which do not have the goal of the flourishing of life, or even the protection of life on earth. Instead of that, we have the chance to completely change that, to enter a place where we can actually do this greatest of tasks, what is needed in this era. We move into such a place. And one part of the narrative that we write is one that we can start right now, even before we move, which again should have been completed by the time this next crisis happens, whatever that may be. We don't know what it's going to be. We don't know what it's going to be. But on a global scale, there are crises that are growing. And the climate crisis being one example. There are many more existential threats. And they are much more serious than this virus. Much more serious. If we're willing to transform our lives for this, if we're willing to overturn our entire economy for this, then we should be many, many times more willing to do that for the other, much more serious crises. And so the question right now is, how do we use this shift to create a resilient civilization that functions in accordance with the beauty of this planet and the beauty of our own true nature, our own original minds? How does that happen? The most important thing we can do now is simply say, that is the goal. That's the opportunity. We take the transformations and the unified awareness of the human race right now, and we use it to change the way our civilization functions for the benefit of all living things. We have that opportunity. We have proven to ourselves that we can completely change the way our society functions in a matter of weeks if we come together around something. It's time for us to come together around a crisis much more severe than this virus. And in fact, it's time for us to come together around several such crises with the courage to know that we can rewrite history. We don't have to rewrite the past. We can rewrite what the future story is that we tell. And that's our opportunity. That's our chance right now. So what is it that we can do? What is it that we can bring forth? First of all, express that narrative. This is a chance to bring forth compassion, to change the way we live. And beyond that, come up with ideas. Come up with ideas. Write them down. Write them down. Share them. So just one idea, I'll lead the way on this, take my own advice, is that it looks like we're going to enter a rather significant economic downturn. So, about 100 years ago, more or less, we had a severe economic downturn, the Great Depression. And one of the ideas that the government, in that case led by President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, one of the ideas that they proposed and actually implemented was something called the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was young people who were hired and housed as they did projects for society, projects to make society healthier. Some of these were bridges or dams and things like that, which were more or less helpful in themselves. But in any case, it was possible to examine what is helpful, and it was possible to give these people a way of moving forward within their own lives. And I'd suggest that again, is a possibility. I'd suggest it's worth a try. And before I say anything more about it, I just want to say, these don't have to be perfect ideas. If you want to prevent new ideas from coming forth, a good way is to say that any idea has to be perfect. That's a great way to prevent creativity. So the ideas that you write down and consider, they don't have to be perfect. Just come up with some idea. Write it down. So here's one. A modern monastic civilian conservation corps. Bring people together and pay them, actually, to cultivate their minds, to find new ways of telling stories, to be sane, to be increasingly sane, and then give them things to do in society to be of benefit in the world. We have crises, and there's work that can be done on behalf of various organizations, various movements, that can be of benefit. So it should be monastic in that there should be a certain amount of personal growth. We know that in places where the society as a whole, the government has supported personal growth, that is very soon, which is to say in a generation or two, of great benefit to society. So at around the same time as this, Scandinavia implemented programming in which large numbers of young people were given opportunities for adult personal development. And Scandinavia went from being one of the most backward parts of the world to being, at this time, one of the leaders in many different areas of society. And a good portion of that was due to these government programs. So this is an opportunity to transform our society by giving a lot of young people the chance to grow internally and maintain themselves, gain skills externally, while simultaneously improving the world. But beyond that specific idea, that's just an example, we have the chance to change the narrative. It isn't merely at this time that we are responding to a specific crisis. That response should be taken as a far greater opportunity. We're not just preventing bad things from happening. We have the chance to use the transformation that has happened over the past several weeks to produce a world in which wonderful things can happen. Not just the same as before, but with fewer deaths due to a certain virus. That's the work that people have been focused on so far, but we can go much further than that. And say, in fact, we're going to create a more beautiful world in which billions fewer people die from other crises. Beyond that, we can create a world in which we're concerned for all living things, in which our love extends to the entire planet, so that we're not just concerned anymore about one species. We're concerned about the most vulnerable people, we're concerned about all people, and we're concerned about all life. If you look at what has actually happened due to this virus, you see that possibly the most important change has been a decrease in carbon emissions. That's magnificent. The climate crisis is far more threatening than the coronavirus regarding the most vulnerable people in the world. It's a much greater threat. And so, good news. We have taken this threat, and it has, partially due just to happenstance, resulted in the protection, the care, although, as I say, somewhat unintentional, but in any case, the protection and care of the most vulnerable people in the world. The climate crisis is much more threatening, far more damaging. It's a far greater crisis to all humans than the coronavirus. It's much more serious. And as I say, good news. This virus has, to a large extent, due to happenstance, resulted in lower carbon emissions, which is good for everyone. And the coronavirus only impacts humans. But the climate crisis impacts all species, the entire planet. And so, if we're concerned about the most vulnerable people in the world, then we see this coronavirus crisis as an enormous opportunity to protect them. And in fact, it already has done this to a certain extent. It's already allowed us to drop our carbon emissions so that those people are protected. We can take that love even further and make sure that the carbon emissions never go back up to the same levels. Ever. That's possible for us. If we care about everyone on Earth, well, good news. All the people are being protected by these lower carbon emissions. So this isn't just that the virus is kept down, but that the carbon emissions, which are much more dangerous, are kept down. This is an enormous success story, but we can take it further and make sure that the carbon emissions never make it up to the same levels again. In fact, continue to decrease until they're gone. So we don't make any anymore, until we've stopped that murderous way of maintaining an economy. And beyond that, if we're worried about life on Earth, if we're concerned about all living things, if we have that deep compassion, the deep love for all of life, and we've managed to wake up from the delusion that human beings are separate, we have a great love, well, then again we see that the lowered carbon emissions are of more benefit to life on Earth than most anything human beings have done in the past, 100 years, anyway. And we can take that even further. We can continue on with that. We have proven that we have that power. And so, our opportunity now is to begin with a regular practice of attending to how we feel, facing death, of doing that in a community by actually moving together so that we can go through the difficult process that community allows, which is to say, maturation. And that we create a new story in which this opportunity is seen as a chance to create a civilization that protects all people and all life on Earth. This ought to burst forth out of us a sense of true excitement, a sense of true exhilaration that we have this opportunity right now. We can't just be passive about it. We have to take action in order to be of true benefit. And each of these parts, the internal, which is to say meditation, the local, which is to say being in healthy, trustworthy communities, and the global, changing our whole civilization by changing the story that we live by. Each of these is connected, interdependent, and each of them is shown now to be feasible. This is possible for us. This is the time that we live in. This is the chance that we have. So please, let us together, with compassion for all beings, take advantage of this magnificent opportunity.